I was going to tell a funny story because when I first met Bennett, I really saw him because I was giving a lecture series talk with Ananthropy and Jonathan Soderstrom and Mark Essen. And during the question and answer session, someone raised their hand. His hair was a little longer. He was wearing this beat up, right? He was like a beat up black leather jacket. And he's like, oh, I have a question. I don't remember what the question was. But it was like, oh, I'm Bennett Foddy, I made QWOP, and there was this murmur that went through the audience. It was like, oh my gosh, the guy made QWOP. So I didn't know at that point that he would be a colleague many years later, and we're all lucky to have him here, so I'll let him take over.
All right, thanks, Charles. I think what I was doing was I was putting ads against games. That's what I was doing.
You talk about how you trick people into clicking on them.
Yeah, that too. All right. Story for another time. So I'm still really close, like probably too close to this project to give a post-mortem or a kind of really analytical account of it. We only just stopped working on it a few days ago. So instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep it pretty simple. I'm just going to tell the story of this game. And then we'll have a bit of time for Q&A, and we're going to set up the game so that you can have a play of final build as well. Okay, so in the beginning there were 4 games. All right, so the first one is a game called Hogra, which Charles commissioned for the No Quarter exhibition here at NYU. Hogra, if you haven't played it, is a ultra minimalistic 4-player hockey game where you move around and pass a puck to each other and you try to get it into these goals in the corner, and it looks a little like this. This is how it looked at No Quarter anyway. And that's by Ramiro Corbetta, who's a local developer. The second game is called Barbary War by Noah Sasso with the help of Richard Terrell, who gave a talk on it recently at Indiecade. It's another No Quarter commission. So they were at the same No Quarter the same year, right? Is that right? Successive years. And so what Barbary War is it's another sort of sports-themed game on a sort of not really a real sport. So it's if you like, Smash Brothers meets volleyball over water. And it looks something like this. The third game was called Johann Sebastian Joust, which is a game that Doug Wilson made with his friends at the Nordic Game Jam some years ago. Originally prototyped with Wii motion controllers, but then they kind of worked and tweaked it, and they found that the PlayStation Move controller was the most effective way of doing it. Essentially, it's a game where you face people in a circle, and there's music playing, and you try to knock the other person's controller so that the accelerometer in it notices some movement without having your own controller knocked. And with the music, it speeds up and slows down. If the music's going fast, then you can move really fast. If it's going slowly, you have to move slowly. So there's this kind of slow motion classical music dance sort of feel about it. So that's that game. And I met Doug Wilson when he made a mod of one of my games called GURPS, one of my web browser games, so that you could play it using 4 Dance Dance Revolution dance mats. So they taped them together. He put letters on so that you could kind of emulate a computer keyboard and move it with your body. So he was kind of expanding the ideas from that he'd been working with Joust and with Button, the other game that he was releasing at the time. And it basically made this really kind of compelling version of GURP that was sort of ridiculous and performative in the same way that Joust was. And he dropped me a line and said, he wanted to get together and do something with it. And at the time, why would you make a kind of a mod of a game like GURP to be played in front of a screen in a kind of ridiculous way? And the answer is that there was this kind of expanding wave, which Charles has called the new arcade movement. I know Doug objects to that phrase for kind of complex theoretical reasons. But there were these events that were going on around the world. No Quarter was one of them. Kokorumi had this event called Gamma. There's Indiecade, Prince of Arcade, Wild Rumpus, Juegos Rancheros, and Baby Castles here in New York, which I've been involved with. And Doug and Ramiro and Noah, their games had been shown at a bunch of these events around the world. They were kind of touring them around and showing them off. And Doug had the idea that he could show MegaGurp, this kind of game which plays with the concept of physical space and the screen, alongside his game Joust in a Baby Castles event in New York City in 2011. And he was sort of organizing that and putting it together with Baby Castles. And so he made contact with me and we were talking about what that would mean. And so we kind of got underway and we got that event going. At the time, I'd been working on this game called Pole Riders, which is the fourth game in this story. Pole Riders, if you haven't played it, is a free web game that I wrote, made most of it at the British Indie Game Jam in 2011. It's a physics-based game, like many of my games, that is essentially polo crossed with pole vaulting. It's for 2 players, and it's guys who are kind of pole vaulting up to kick a ball that's suspended on a pulley from a rope. So again, this kind of got something in common with Hoka and Barbary War, and also we felt like something also somehow in common with Joust and with MegaGurp. So I decided that I would show it at that Baby Castles show in 2011. It just looks like this. If you haven't played it, it's free on my website. So we put this event together. We had MegaGurp and Joust and Pole Riders. We also had Hit Me by Kahu Abe, who's an artist in residence over here at the Game Innovation Lab. And again by Matt Parker as well, Duello, which is a kind of a motion-controlled dueling game with no screen. So we wanted to do something interesting with the presentation. You can see what we wound up coming up with is not really ideal for Pole Riders. We had the idea of projecting it on the ceiling. And it was projected on this kind of corrugated metal, and people had to kind of look up and play it like this. It was not really ideal. That's what people looked like when they were playing it. And I think the show went really well, and I think it was like one of the best Baby Castles shows. It was probably the best one I was involved with, and many people said it was one of the best ones they'd been to. But I kind of didn't really feel good about the game at that point, and not just because of that presentation, but just because of various sort of design problems I've been having with it. And so I just sort of sat on it for 3 months. I kind of wasn't working on it. I just put it away. I was kind of dissatisfied. But one of the things that happened over that time is that people wanted to show it after the Baby Castles thing. They'd kind of heard about it. So I heard from the people at Prince of Arcade who wanted to show it in Canada, and had a really positive response there. And then people from Wild Rumpus wanted to show it at GDC in 2012. That's what this is. Got really well received there. And then I started to hear from people at Harmonix and Firaxis who were playing it on their lunch break. I kind of started to take the view that culture is supposed to be a dialogue, right? It's not a series of statements where you come up with the kind of thing that you think is perfect, this kind of masterwork idea. So it's okay to put out something that you think is kind of fundamentally flawed, and I just decided to launch it publicly at that point. That was really like small potatoes though, because at this stage the other games that I've been talking about were winning all these awards. This is Joust winning the Game Developers Choice Innovation Award at GDC 2012. A lot of things happened over this period of a year or 2 years. There were a lot of other games coming through as well. Nidhogg, another no-quarter commission, Samurai Gun, Towerfall, Zero Space, and lots of these other games that were really kind of presenting well in this event space, in this kind of eventing scene. And I think there was a kind of growing sense in the community that there's a kind of a latent interest in local multiplayer games, that there is a kind of a pent-up demand for them. And we were touring them around, and kind of that sort of sense that we had was getting more and more pronounced. So we started to think about, how can we make a public release of these things? How can we make it mainstream? How can we sell them? But it's kind of a really deep problem commercially. It's one thing to make these games in such a form that you can put them on a cabinet and have it, be shown to a couple of hundred people for one night, and if it crashes or if people don't understand it, you can come in as a developer and intervene. But it's another thing to charge $15 for it on Steam or on the PlayStation Store. It's a really kind of serious problem, and there's a few reasons for that. So first of all, none of these games would work online, right? So that's kind of the typical way that you go about adding value to a multiplayer game so that people will pay for it. You kind of add in an online mode. Hopra is so minimal and so fast that you notice input lag really bad. In fact, we've been trying to test it around the place. If the TV that you're playing Hopra on is not set to game mode, you can barely even play it. So it's a kind of case where lag is really a serious problem. My game Polaroid, you can't synchronize physics engines. It uses this kind of complicated simulation to simulate the bendable poles. You can't synchronize them across a network, right? Which is why you don't see physics-based games, multiplayer games that are playable online. There are games like Diablo 3 or FIFA that have some kind of physics effects that you see that's all generated on your console or your computer, but it's just sort of technically impossible to have kind of complicated physics interactions going across the network. And I think, Barbary War would, even though it's kind of the most networkable of all of these games, would be enormously worsened by the kinds of code that you would have to bring in. And Joust couldn't even exist online. It wouldn't make sense. The whole kind of premise of Joust is that you're in a circle, you're kind of dancing around people, you're pushing on their bodies, and it just couldn't really exist online. So that is kind of ruled out for these sorts of games. And the other thing that people do to add value to multiplayer games is to add a single player mode. So you take something you've designed, this is Hopra being played by one player. You take something that's been designed from the ground up for multiplayer, and you just sort of shoehorn in a single player mode. So Samurai Gun recently and Nidhogg and Towerfall have all got these challenge modes where you take the multiplayer game and you implement AI characters or bots that you play against. But even if we wanted to do that, and I think we didn't want to do it, you face kind of design and technical problems with the games, with these 4 games, if you try and do that. So Polaroid has this, as they say, complicated physics engine that would be way too unpredictable for an AI. It would be too hard. You would need an incredibly smart AI to be able to work out what was going on at any given time. Hopra is so minimal that I think it would be more or less meaningless against an AI. You could have like a perfect AI that always passed in the correct direction and always stole the puck from you really effectively, but it just wouldn't be interesting, right? Again, unless you made an AI that was so complex as to be basically a human being. And then Joust, again, it's like it's the most fundamentally multiplayer of any game design. So these are games that we couldn't do that for. So we're sort of racking our brains for what we should do about that. And I mean, I think we're also coming out of this context where we've got this huge player base, all these gamers who get mad at you if you don't have a single player mode, if you don't have a network mode. And I guess the reason for that is that every AAA game has both of those things. You think about, Battlefield, or and think about how mad people are about Titanfall, which has just come out without a single player mode. There's this kind of sense that in order to charge money for a game and to give people value for that, it has to have both of those things. So we were trying to think, how will we be able to sell these games? And Ramiro and Doug were talking about it, and correct me if I've got the story of this wrong, but they had the idea of a compilation, like summer games from the 80s, or like Wii Sports, and kind of tossing that back and forward and getting encouragement from certain people, including the people at Wild Rumpus. And they invited me to bring my game, Polaroid, on board in a compilation, and then later we invited Noah for Barbary War, with Doug producing the project. Doug, in the first place, didn't even think about bringing Joust in. He'd been talking to Sony about releasing his game as a first-party product on the PlayStation 3. But eventually he decided to bring that game in as well. So at that point we had 4 games. We had a kind of meaningful compilation, a kind of an indie Wii Sports. But we still had to figure out where to put it. Where will people buy and play a multiplayer compilation like that? Where is the biggest multiplayer platform? And people often talk about how the size of the audience for a video game depends on the sales of the platform, right? So you'll sell well if you're on the popular platform. If you're on the Ouya, you won't sell at all. But what we're discovering through this process is that for local multiplayer games, it's really players that are the platform, right? You need the right kind of players. And you might have 300 million people who own a console, or even like countless more who own a computer that can play games. but only a tiny little fraction of those have more than one controller to play games with. And really crucially, only a tiny fraction of them have friends who are willing to and sort of available to play games with them. So this is the kind of problem, is that the platform is really small. We'd also learned, through this process of touring around and eventing, we'd kind of learned that that local multiplayer games work best with these sort of social scaffolds in place. So you want to be able to see the faces of your opponents. You want to be able to hand off the controller to other players after you've played for a little while. Excuse my phone, which is buzzing. You want to be able to stand behind the players and spectate. It's this kind of spectatorship aspect is really, really crucial. There's this kind of shared learning. So what's going on while you're playing is people are standing behind you and they're watching and they're developing their own theories about how they're going to play, and they're judging your performance and they're cheering. And it's this kind of scaffolding that draws people in. That's where the kind of best experience is. So if you're going to kind of give people the best experience, you need to capture that. And this is the real success of Joust, by the way. I think this is it's this game that everybody feels sort of entitled and kind of willing and able to jump into. So we needed something like that. And finally, we had these games where, they're kind of in a sense bound to standardized high-quality controllers, right? Especially Joust, that needs a controller that has lights and accelerometers in order to be able to indicate who's winning and who's losing, because they can't look at the screen. So a PC release on its own wasn't really ideal, and we felt where we really needed to be was on a console. So on a console, it's already been sort of solved in a sense. There's this shared open space, the couch, the TV, where people already feel this kind of sense of appropriate space to play a game. People already feel like they can stand behind the couch and watch and jump in, be drawn in. And I think console manufacturers understood and kind of cracked that back in the 80s when many of the games, I won't say most, but many of the games that were popular in the kind of early 80s were exactly like this. They were local multiplayer only games where you sat on a couch with a friend or a family member and you played a video game. And I think that's where, can't speak for the other guys, but for me that's where my best gaming experiences have been, my most formative video game experiences, and the most important and kind of formative experiences for me as a designer. And so that's something that we wanted to capture. So it's kind of the idea that what we were going to do is not the new arcade. It was more like the new combat. This is the new, the new Atari 2600 combat. So we had Sony sort of interested in kind of giving us a pub fund deal, kind of helping to get the game on PS3, but not enough to kind of really cover the scope of what we wanted to do. Quite a lot of ambition for this. So we ran a Kickstarter for $150,000. And it was really tough to get the enthusiasm going where we needed it to be. I mean, you can look at this, it's kind of interesting. When we announced our Kickstarter, we got a lot of press. A lot of the people who were covering us, a lot of the journalists and the kind of fans who were talking about us had been to the events where we'd been touring around and showing the games, and there was a huge amount of enthusiasm. We had a great first couple of days, and then it just bombed. And right up until the last sort of 3 or 4 days of the project, it just looked like we weren't going to get there, until the same people came back and they upped their pledges. So there's this kind of huge enthusiasm amongst a small number of people who had tried the games, which we're incredibly grateful for. But it kind of really underscores the size of the enormity of the problem of getting people back into playing multiplayer games in their homes. All right, so we got underway, we got the funding, we were ready to go. And for me, this was an opportunity to fix some of the things that were broken in my original game. I said I was unhappy with the design in some ways. So I'm going to just sort of drill into the design a little bit and the things that were not satisfactory to me, just so you can kind of see what was in my mind. That's the goal, that kind of blue and yellow object, and the kind of core problem with the original Polaroid's design is that I'd laid it out in such a way you could block the goal with your pole, right? Like you just stop the other person from getting near the goal by putting your pole up. And the solutions I came up with for this is so kind of woefully inelegant. It's really embarrassing and I feel really regretful about it, but I think it's worth talking about. So, well, first of all, I would allow the other player to push you back. So there's this door in the wall that the blue player can pass through, but the yellow player can't. So it's like it opens when the blue player comes near and he can be pushed back. But then I found that they could still like stand back through the door and hold their pole up. Still not really working. So I made it that invisibly his pole arm would get weaker and he would find it harder to hold the pole up when he was standing near his own goal. Just a terrible, like horrible design. So that was one of the things. We often saw when we were, well, about 50% of the time, when we would show these things live, we would see these kind of standoff situations as well. So in this original Polaroid, so this was a real problem when we showed the game in a sort of tournament to promote our Kickstarter at Parsons. Andy Nealon and, was it Rob? Rob Miter as well as, who was?
Matt Parker.
And Matt Parker, right, okay, so they both got it into their heads somehow that just sort of holding your pole up and standing still was this kind of undefeatable maneuver, which is not, incidentally. You can just move the pole down and you kill the other guy. But they were just sure, and so it was like we would get these standoffs where people would just stop. And we had to restart the game because neither person was willing to try anything any different. Which is like, I mean, again, I sort of resisted this, but it's a design fault in the game I wanted to fix. And I had problems with the physics as well, so I had a lot of things that I wanted to address. I added a bunch of levels, so each of them sort of found a way around the goal problem differently. So this is the first one I made, and I don't know why I didn't think of this before. This is kind of a much more elegant solution to the goal blocking problem. There is just a ditch on either side of the field, and when you're standing in the ditch, you can't get your pole high enough to block the goal. So that's just one way of solving the problem. You don't have to do any kind of magical changes to the player's properties or anything like that. Then I had the idea of these goal backboards where the players could just go past them, but the ball couldn't, which kind of completely solves the problem as well. It's probably the best solution. And there might also be a level with a hole in between the goal and the player as well. To resolve the deadlocks I was talking about, I rewrote the way that the input works. So instead of having a kind of a digital input scheme like I did with the web version, it's completely analog. So you push, you've got a stick to move yourself left and right with your legs. And then if you push the stick in a direction, your character will try to move his pole around in that direction. It adds, this is like not often used in fact I can't think about any other game that uses this input method. But it adds enough kind of granularity and analogness that it completely solves the deadlock problem. We haven't really seen anybody trying to just stand still and act as though that's a complete solution. I wanted to do something else to avoid the deadlock, which was to add a sudden death mode. But I didn't want it to feel boring, so this is how I did it in 2 players. You get a hammer. And this is how I did it in 4 players. Nobody has yet gotten good at this, by the way. It's pretty confusing.
Oh, God.
Ramiro updated that with a kind of updated, much cleaner look, even more minimal look, and a level editor, and a bunch of new levels and kind of level objects to kind of construct levels out of. For Barbary War, Noah and Richard went really deep. I mean, it doesn't really look any different than subtly different than the no quarter version, but the systems are just incredibly much deeper, and it's kind of the combo system and the fighting game systems have been fleshed out in a very kind of thoroughgoing way. Incidentally, like late in the project, this has become the game that we play the most internally now because it's sort of built for that depth. This just looks more or less the same though. And for Joust, Doug added graphics so that the game could be played by people who had controllers that didn't have lights in them. So a dual shock controller, anything that vibrates is now kind of viable controller for Joust. And he added a whole bunch of different kind of special modes to it as well. Wonderful character art by Dominique Verland. Okay. Now, a funny thing happened while we were doing this. I think we noticed that we were starting to influence each other's, both as players and as designers. So I've got a picture here is of Rob and Grant are arguably the best Hokra team in the world. They've played probably more Hokra than anybody else in the world. What they're doing here is they're playing the game that I have called True Hokra. True Hokra is where you're controlling. In Hokra, it's always 2 versus 2. It's teams of 2. In True Hokra, it's 2 players, each one controlling 2 players, 2 characters, I guess, two squares in the game. So you're controlling one with your right thumb and the other one with your left thumb. You kind of have to separate both halves of your brain. And when you see people who are starting to play True Hokra, they don't play it well. You see like one of the squares will just stop for a while as they kind of focus on that one. But when you get good at it, you're kind of really in the zone. Ramiro hates us playing this, but he thinks it's a stupid game, but it's actually like it's kind of got an emergent appeal that has just sort of started to take hold, and we play it quite a lot internally, and you can see people really respond to it well. This is something that just kind of came out of the process through the process of testing and playing and kind of trying out different things. In the first place, we were really just playing a lot of this sort of 2-player Hokra as a way of making it easier to test. Much easier to test with 2 players than to try to get 4 people around the computer. But it just turned out to be like a really fun way of playing. The other thing that happened is there's this thing that is kind of a really good example of how we influenced one another. So Ramiro put in this secret taunt. You can see the player running with the ball is like circling. And it was a secret. He wouldn't tell me how to do it. We were demoing the game at GDC last year, and he's like, he keeps on taunting while he's got the ball is like running away from me and taunting and taunting. I'm like, how do you do it? He goes, it's the accelerometer. And then every time he does it, he goes like this with the controller. And I'm standing there going, why isn't this working? He was just trolling me. He just wasn't telling me what to do. Noah added a secret taunt into Barbary War as well. You can see, again, secret. You can do this if you're winning. Joust has secret taunts as well. So I took the unprecedented step. As far as I'm aware, nobody has done this in multiplayer history, of making a taunt move that affects the other player, right? So in this case, I'm the guy on the left. Looks a little bit like Notch. Okay, so it's fantastic, you're winning, everyone's fighting. I am still the only one who knows how to do that. The other guys still, even though they have access to the code, they don't know how to trigger that. And I obfuscated, with the help of Jonathan, our programmer, I obfuscated the code so that they can't work it out. As we went further, we got, this became a little bit of an obsession. We got a little bit addicted to adding secret content and secret moves to the game. There's now sort of dozens of secrets in Sportsfriends. This is like just an example, but I think that in terms of as designers, we were really having an effect on how we were developing and finishing our game. And there's a lot of work between having the kind of event-worthy game, the game that you can show in public and play in public and tour with, and then having the thing that you can sell. That's been like 1.5 years of work for us. But this is like there's still room for some design changes in that process, and this is a lot of the stuff that kind of went in. I feel like production-wise, the other thing that's interesting about this project is I feel like we're actually doing something that's sort of genuinely new. Everybody has complete creative control over their own game. I mean, we do make suggestions. We do strongly. Tried really hard to get Ramiro to fix his bugs. But everybody ultimately has final say over what goes into their game and what comes out. It's like this. We're working together, and especially like we have to work together on the front end and all the kind of like the boring stuff. But the actual creative work is separated. It's like I liken it to being like in the world's uncoolest rock band. We're touring together, we're doing interviews together, we're working on this kind of boring release stuff, the bureaucracy together. We have dinner with the A&R dude from Sony together. It's like, it really kind of bears a lot in common with that model. And I can't think of too many other video game development teams who have done this. It's not, I don't mean to say that it's kind of the perfect model for all cases. I mean, it's certainly, it's not as though it totally eliminates friction between people on the team. But it does eliminate a certain kind of creative tension where people are like overriding each other's creative choices and the kind of creative buyout that can happen on a big hierarchical team. So I think it's kind of interesting from that point of view. And the other great thing about it is it sort of maximizes authorship. You feel as though you can have that experience that normally only solo developers can have, which is that feeling of being completely responsible for a game from beginning to end. And I think also what's great about it is a structure that supports friendship too. In the face of all of the kind of bullshit that goes into bringing a game from prototype to finished event game to sellable product, it has that kind of positive friendship supporting feel about it as well. So I think we named it pretty well when we called it Sportsfriends. And we submitted it yesterday. So in honor of that, I'm going to finish just by showing you, thank you. I'm just going to finish by showing you our launch trailer. Hopefully we've got enough. Hopefully that's enough volume.
Because I'm pretending to be Frank Lance tonight, I'm going to ask Bennett a few questions, and then we're going to open it up to all of you, because I'm sure your questions will be much more interesting. Okay, so it's going to be confusing because I have this, but you have plenty.
I think it's going to be okay.
I think it's okay. All right. So the first question I have to ask is it with one T or two?
It's funny. I've been plagued my whole life with people spelling my name with one T. And it became a thing that the other guys were trying to slip into the code. They were trying to put Bennett with one T hidden away in the code. I threatened to put a define though. It'd be like define Bennett. Solve the problem. But no, we're good on that now. 2 T's.
So okay, 1 T. Thank you. I'm just going to correct this right here. So. Actually, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that, because it's part of this project that really does intrigue me is the sense of 4 designers who are all equal coming together, and you've all been working on this for what, a year or so now, maybe even longer.
Year and a half.
What could you talk a little bit more about that experience? I mean, what were the good moments and bad moments? Like, what was the toughest part of it? What's the best part of it for you?
And it's been very atypical. Amongst game development projects, partly because we were starting with things that were so finished looking, and partly because of the structure of the team and the way that the roles are separate. Look, I think it has gone basically according to plan. Honestly, it certainly. Our original estimate of fall 2013, we kind of fell away from that. Part of the reason for that is we realized we could be on PS4 as well as PS3. which kind of pushed it out by a season. Some things just turned out to be more complicated than others as well. But look, getting a game on a console is kind of at the back end of it is a kind of horrible, messy process. It's huge bureaucratic. I'm glad none of our Sony reps are here, are they? It's making a face. They've been great to work with, but it's complicated, and it's for a small team. It's still hard. But I think for all of that, it's been good. It's been a rewarding process, and we've had our hands on it in a way that we couldn't have done if we were using an external porting house or something like that.
I do want to talk a little bit about you as a designer, because you started out talking about how you had gotten here. You make funny games. I remember my experience growing up was that there weren't really funny games. Like there were games that had funny stuff in them, but not was just like hilarious to play. But with QWOP and GURP and Pole Riders, like these are games that people just like they laugh while they're playing them. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on what do you think that is? Is it because of physics? You're also someone who's really interested in physics in games. Are those two things connected for you?
I think they are. I mean, I think it's through physics that I kind of found a focus on troll design.
What do you mean troll design?
Troll design, I mean pranking the player, making fun of the player, disrespecting the player. I think that's kind of core to my practice. But I don't want to say that that's new to me, because I came up, in Australia, we got mainly European games and computer games, and the games came out of Britain in the 80s were incredibly focused on humor. I mean, some of them were just entirely sort of joke games. And so, for me, that's the kind of core of my understanding of what games are and can be. I do think that, if you grew up playing only Nintendo games, you don't get much humor at all until kind of Conker's Bad Fur Day, which is a British game. It comes out of that same tradition. So I feel like there is more humor and kind of more light-hearted thing coming out of Europe.
Yeah. So you were a philosopher of ethics
yes.
before you got here to NYU to be an academic game designer. I guess I don't even know what that means. Do you ever think you will do a serious game? Eric Zimmer was about to beat us to death with stools, by the way. It's because I forgot to mention the sponsors.
Thanks, Eric.
Stools the sponsor.
This interview brought to you by Stools.
Sorry, you...
Now we're both very orange.
Yeah. Yes, it's good. It's like X-Files episode.
What was I asking you?
I don't know. I was hoping you would recap it.
What was I asking you, everybody?
Eric?
No one was paying attention.
Whether you're gonna make a serious game.
Oh, are you
right,
going to make
right.
a serious game? Maybe
Right.
make a game that made me cry.
Yeah, no, I'm not going to do that.
No.
I mean, I love serious games. I love that. I just think that in some sense your game designs have to reflect who you are in some sort of way. It's not really. I'd like to make you cry, but not in that way.
So you're just not a serious person, is what you're saying.
Right, essentially. But essentially, I think you have to know that about yourself, right? There are some people who live in serious stories and serious emotions, and that's not really.
And some people live in fart jokes. That's what they like more than anything.
No, come on, man.
All right.
I'm just going to say, if you haven't put, if any of you are a game designer or a game design student and you haven't put a fart joke in a game,
You're failing.
I'm going to fail you. But also, you're just missing out on good experiences.
It's true. Okay.
Fart jokes and rainbows. That's what I learned in this project. I've got to put more rainbows in games.
Yeah.
Color is important. Yeah. Excellent. So you, what's interesting about Sportsfriends, especially for someone like me, is because when I first started becoming a game designer, I was really interested in these local multiplayer things, and I always thought it was kind of a New York thing. But then you show up, Doug Wilson has done an enormous amount. It really does feel now like there's kind of a moment that's happening, that local multiplayer is having this renaissance. I was wondering. Right now, we've just had a bunch of, it's been going for maybe 3 years, you might say, and we've just now had actual commercial releases, right? We've had Needhog, we've had Samurai Gun, we're about to have Sportsfriends. What do you think, because for me that was always a big hurdle. Like, can this actually lead to a commercial release, or are we gonna have to like build this huge gallery scene that's gonna support people? What do you think comes next? What's the next hurdle? What do you think is interesting?
I think we're going to see whether this is a viable way for people to support themselves as designers. It's still an experiment. I mean, it's a huge. We knew going into this that you're talking about essentially an unsolved problem, which is how do you take these things that people love and there's clearly demand for, but then kind of parlay that through into the living room. And I don't know yet whether or not we've succeeded in doing that. I don't think it's clear yet whether those other games that you mentioned, including Tower 4, which had a really warm reception in the press especially, I don't know if it's clear whether they've managed to do it. And it may all turn out to be a failure and we'll have to start again from zero. But I guess it's going to depend on what falls out in the next year. And we do see, it was nice to say this and kind of flatter myself, we do see people who were at those events that we were touring around, and people who were playing the games and who had never made a multiplayer game before, coming back the next year and the year after with new things that they made as a result of that, or they tell us about new events that they formed as a result of that. So there is I think so long as there is that sort of demand, the pent-up demand for that social gaming experience, that it will continue to happen. I don't think it's clear what the form will be, though.
Dwayne, do you feel like, I guess the question is, because this is something I wonder as the curator of No Quarters, like, is this something that's just going to keep going, like keep growing, there'll be more and more influence, or do you think we've peaked, or do you think that like the moment's about to end and something new is going to come around, there's a new fashion, or what are you betting?
I'm betting it hasn't peaked. I'm betting, but I think there is probably a limit to how big it can be. I think one of the things that we've found out is that you can't just take any old game and put it in a public space. Can't take it, even a kind of a purely local multiplayer game can't necessarily work in the public space. And the ones that work in the public space don't necessarily work in the living room. And so it's because it's only the kind of small, like a small number of those games that really work well. It's always going to be this kind of sort of a small, I won't say a niche thing necessarily, it's always going to be a kind of a subculture. I don't think it's going to get to the point where everybody is playing Joust in Central Park. But I think it's got some room to grow still. I think it can, I really feel like if Wii Sports can do as well as it did, I mean, there is clearly a chance to kind of crack into the mainstream, even with sort of more challenging, more experimental games than the ones. I mean, to be honest, Wii Sports is an experimental game. Although it's kind of cloaked in the theme of existing sports, it was a kind of wild experiment. And if Wii Sports had been made by an indie game developer on a shoestring budget, we would be talking about it as part of this scene probably. So I do think that there is a kind of there is the kind of potential to have something bigger happen, but it probably will take time.
So obviously you guys just submitted last night, congratulations. So you're probably still kind of in the weeds, right? You haven't yet sort of come out of the forest. But do you have any thoughts on what's next for you? Like are you going to continue to experiment with local multiplayer? Are there other ideas you want to try out?
Yeah, if I go through my notebooks, like every design is a multiplayer game. I can't help it. Those are the ones that, I guess it's just being in that space and thinking about it. It tends to be that inspiration comes from working in a space rather than sort of out of nowhere. So I would be surprised if I change course on that. I think it's going to be nice to make some kind of small event style games that I don't need to get onto a console for a little while. So I'll probably spend some time prototyping. I'm sure the other guys will tell you the same.
All right, well, that's all I have. So let's open up questions to the audience. Anybody have a question for Professor Bennett Foddy? Yes, in the center.
You're saying that you like to make games that are funny or a little bit abusive. Are there any other games by other designers that you think sort of follow along? I'm just saying because I've been playing Goat Simulator, and that seems to fit that kind of.
Yeah, I haven't played Goat Simulator yet. It looks great. It looks like the kind of thing I would enjoy. But I don't think that slapstick is the only kind of humor. There is a kind of a sadistic humor in Mark Essen's punishment games that I like, and in Michael Kyan O'Reilly's games, I Want to Be the Guy, and I Want to Be the Guy Guiding. I find that pretty hilarious. There's also a kind of the games that make me laugh the most are sort of unintentionally hilarious. I don't mean this as a kind of backhanded critique. I mean, it's like something that I really appreciate. Games like Facade and Heavy Rain. I laughed harder at the first, like the opening scene in Heavy Rain than I'd laughed in probably 5 years. It's like making me like press a button to pull on clothes and try and go downstairs not wearing clothes, and then your wife comes in for a kiss and you've got to do like this QTE. You can kind of get close for a kiss and then pull back. So I mean, I hope people won't think it's just about doing slapstick. I think that there is a lot. It's still early days for humor in video games. I think it's like, many of the early kind of comedy movies were sort of based in slapstick. You think about the most popular things like the Marx Brothers, for example, and Charlie Chaplin, and then it sort of blossoms out into like more different styles of things. I'm hoping we'll see that sort of happening.
Right here.
A really stupid question. So you showed us special moves for every Sportsfriends game but Joust.
Right.
Will you demonstrate for us a Joust special?
Yes. I mean, they're not visual, of
Oh, no.
course, right? So I didn't have a video to show of it, but yeah, if you come after the Q&A session, come into the Red Room, play some Joust, you'll probably see some special moves.
Okay. Makes sense.
What kind of challenges do you face integrating 4 games into one executable? There's 4 different coders, yeah?
Yeah, and based on 4 different programming languages. So Barbary War is a game maker game, Poker is XNA, Polaroid is Flash, and Joust was in Unity. So that's kind of a worst case scenario. What we did is Gaijin Games, who make the Bit Trip series, were kind enough to give us their cross-platform engine for free. It's a C++ engine. It's very low level, but we basically had to code everything from scratch, including the sprite classes and the sound playing classes and animations and so on. So it was not a small job. The payoff is that we can publish to any one of 12 different platforms and know that it will run the same way, and that it's kind of it's a high performing, clean thing. And once it's debugged, it's really debugged, and you have control over things. The downside has been we spend weeks, if not months, with kind of inexplicable memory corruption bugs that turned out to be our fault, but just almost indetectable things. Like, for example, we would start the game and there would be like, on some PlayStations, but not on all of them, there would be this kind of just almost unnoticeable but noticeable black kind of distortion on the loading screen. It's just driving us crazy. And finally found it. So that kind of stuff you wouldn't, if you made the whole game in Game Maker, you wouldn't have that problem. I don't think as a team, I don't think we have regrets about the choice we made in the end, though. It has been a lot of work to bind things together into one executable, but I think we made the best choice, given that we were in that kind of worst case scenario.
All the way in the back.
With all this sort of like, I guess, physical involvement, like games that require physical involvement, what's been a good way or easiest way to kind of get people who haven't done that before to feel comfortable to get involved and get over that embarrassment factor?
I mean, I think that's like, Doug wrote a whole PhD thesis on this question. It's kind of very, very complicated and deep one. But as a kind of as a sort of somebody who's outside of that sort of deep decision-making process in some way, I can say that Joust seems to solve that problem in some way. And I sort of speculate that part of it is about having a circle, like people playing in a circle and facing each other. And there are kind of certain cultural symbols that seem to make it easier for people to give each other permission to play a video game. Because a lot of people, I think, especially older people, or kind of professionals, people who haven't been playing games, just feel as though it's embarrassing or it's like they're inhibited, and they need somehow to be given a kind of social permission to be involved. Somehow the circle of people facing each other seems to do that to some extent. The absence of a screen, the absence of the kind of this facing the screen, sitting on the couch, adopting that kind of traditional gamer pose, that seems to help. But the thing that's nice about the circle, and to a lesser extent about the other games which we play on projectors in these events, is you can stand back, right? You can watch people play. There's no pressure to play if you don't want to. And I think that's also part of what gives, like if you can feel entertained just standing there, and maybe you're sort of getting comfortable with it, and you can kind of just hang there until you're ready to come in, and then it's possible in a way that it's not if it's like, hey, come over here and play a video game with me, on the computer. It's almost impossible.
Yeah, I mean, one of the experiences we've always had doing no quarter, and usually the advice I give is, I mean, I don't know, I haven't written a PhD about it, but our experience is that if it feels like by watching you can learn how to play the game, that seems to make people much more comfortable walking up and picking it up. Otherwise, they just don't. The fear seems to be that they're going to look stupid, but if they feel like, I'm not going to look that stupid.
Right, now the other thing that Doug writes about in his PhD is and correct me again if I'm wrong, is like a big part of it is designing games where the people who are playing look stupid. You think about charades as a really good example. So if you're standing in that periphery watching people playing, and everybody who's actually involved in playing, even if they're like super expert, even if they're kind of pro level players, they look kind of ridiculous. That's the kind of nature of the game. And Joust definitely has that, because you're moving around in slow motion, and people just watching you. It's like, I'm not going to look more stupid than that guy. That's the feeling, right? Like I know I'm going to. This kind of karaoke works this way as well. Is you kind of need someone to get up there and kind of drunkenly slur out some song in a horrible way. That's what gives you permission to go up and do a bad job, and I think people need that. A lot of people need that to be able to get up there.
How'd you pick your part sound?
I didn't make it, if that's what you're No, I don't remember. Maybe I did. I'm not sure. I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer.
For someone who pretends to care about this very much, you seem to have a very lackadaisical.
It was putting it in. I mean, the thing is that I came up with that idea, and I was at our programmer's house in Oxford, in England, and between coming up with the idea and having it in the game, it was about 15 minutes. Then that was over. So I've kind of
Is there
it.
someone out there who's going to play this and then recognize their part? Some random internet?
Yeah, it's interesting. We've put maybe somebody. That's me. Maybe.
A long scream of farts.
It's a good question whether anybody will discover how to do it by accident. It's none of the other guys, despite kind of hundreds of hours of testing, have managed to even like trigger it by accident, which I think is pretty good. I'm pretty proud of that, because you have to be able to do it without moving your hands, right? Like otherwise, people can just see what button you were pressing. That's how I worked out ultimately how to do the taunt in Hogra. I just watched him closely until finally I could see he's pressing the buttons. But we've got all these secrets in the game that people might never see. It's kind of interesting. That's something that couldn't happen in larger studios. If there were like a lot of people depending on it, you'd be trying to convince someone, let's implement this secret, and they'd be like, well, no one's going to see that. I don't think it's a waste of time. But nobody could stop me putting in this feature. So it's got like more sort of depth of secret content than most games do.
I was thinking, when you're playing games like Street Fighter 2, something that can be quite off-putting is when you get the floor wiped with you by an expert player, and that can put people off wanting to get involved. So how did you sort of balance this with wanting to reward expert players?
You say, you mean like somebody who's like really practiced a lot?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and it's definitely true that it seems to be true that the more sort of layers of depth you put into a kind of a adversarial system, the higher the kind of barrier can be to new players. One of the ways we address that in the public space is by designing games that people hand off quite quickly, right? So even if there's some kind of shark there on Hopper right now, and I'm never going to win against that person. I can just wait until they rotate out, and I'll play against somebody else. So there's that kind of approach to it. The other thing is that each of our 4 games is different in this regard. So Polaroid is, I'm the best at it, so we get a sense at arguably I'm the best at it, but you get a sense of what it means for there to be a skill gap. It's more of like the kind of game that a beginner might fluke a win against a master. And Barbary War, you'll just never win if the person is much better than you, because it's much deeper and you can play it at kind of a higher, kind of more sort of super pro level. And I think it's important that in our compilation we have a kind of spectrum of different levels of depth like that. And as I say, I think we've gone from mostly playing Pole Riders, we were sitting down, we're going to leave Joust out of it because we have to be standing up for that. We've gone from mostly playing Pole Riders to mostly playing Hope Rider, mostly playing Barbary War over a period of time. So I think we'll see similar thing with people who buy the game.
So you feel like you guys reached the skill ceiling of
No, definitely not. I think it's more like, a lot of the pleasure in adversarial games is that feeling of improving, right? So we still have more, maybe there's more way to go. Like when Ramiro and I were at GDC demoing the game, I feel like I finally grasped how to play it, and I've been playing it a lot. I mean, it took me quite a long time just to be able to get to that point where I could say with confidence that I thought I was going to win a game. I'm still playing sort of cheesy, gross game, but I'm starting to win some of the time. So it's not that we kind of maxed anything out. It's that pleasant feeling of forward progress.
Noah is specifically interested in creating a game that, like Smash Brothers, might have a tournament scene around it.
Yeah.
Are you and the other, like Ramiro and Doug, are you interested in that sort of audience as much?
I can't necessarily speak for them, but I think we're all interested in that. It's not yet clear to me exactly what supports that, though, right? Like, I mean, it's not as though. It's definitely true that Street Fighter and Smash Brothers are deep in that way. That Barbary War is deep, and that's definitely. I think it would be fair to say that that's what supports that kind of high level competitive play. But people play games that don't have that kind of depth as well at a high level way as well. I mean, so you can kind of focus on small differences, and you can invent new ways of strategizing and playing. There's like a new there's this meta game around simple games as well. So I think any one of them could really kind of gain traction that way. I think the kind of question of what makes things become to accrue that kind of culture around them is a kind of difficult and complex one.
As a designer who's making local multiplayer games, and as someone who's observing the rising of these types of games, do you foresee a potential risk of homogeneous or monolithic design culture when it comes to creating these types of games? And is there something as we as designers can do to prevent that?
I think it's a really good question. I think the answer is no, just purely based on my kind of admittedly anecdotal experience of going around and visiting these parties and going to these things. There is a kind of really strong, not enforced norm, but a strongly sort of self-enforced norm of diversity amongst these games. It's like there aren't Joust clones, there aren't Pole Riders clones going around. It's one of the most diverse and novel fields of game design. So at the moment, I just think the worry that it's going to be kind of genreified is premature. Maybe eventually that'll happen. It definitely happened with the original arcade games. They became incredibly homogenized, but that doesn't seem to be happening with the event scene right now.
Any other questions? Yeah, Matt.
So near the beginning, you said you don't. Charles made a comment about whether or not you want to make people cry, and then you made some jokes about Heavy Rain. So I'm wondering, it seems to me though that you actually do want to make people cry. You do frequently, right? Because I mean, you're really, when you say you want to try to hurt the player.
Tears of anger, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm wondering though, what is the difference between different kinds of crying, and what's the difference between the meaningful experience you get from sports versus sort of capital A, art?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it might be a little above my pay grade. I guess I would say.
It's not. That's actually what we pay you for.
Exactly my pay grade. I think the answer to that is nobody is going to say that because they cried after playing Plop that it's the Citizen Kane of video games.
No, but if it's the baseball of video games, that like what if in 40 years somebody makes a movie that's like Field of Dreams, except it's about sports friends, and their dead dad comes back to life at the end and plays Barbary Ball with them. I mean, wouldn't that be a much huger cultural achievement than fucking Heavy Rain?
You're saying I should go for tears of beauty and sublime emotion?
No. I guess I'm just wondering what is the. I mean, you can look at that kind of cultural achievement as being more profound, I guess, than what's going on in so-called serious art. And I'm just wondering, like, do you think about that at all, or is it just?
Yeah, look, I don't mean to kind of underplay what I'm doing as trivial at all, and I think that dimensions of frustration and confusion. It's sad that that's kind of been written out of commercial games, and I think people know that it's sad, and I think part of why the Dark Souls series has been so influential, and amongst designers especially, is that there is a sense in which that there is a kind of I hesitate to use the word beauty, it doesn't seem right, but something like there is a kind of a sublime aspect to certain kinds of certain dimensions of confusion and frustration that are not exploited in other media to the same extent, or can't be to the same extent. And you know, I've had experiences playing games where I don't know what to do, or I've been set back a long way, where it's like there's a kind of a depth of emotion and a kind of a power of the experience that in some ways goes beyond Field of Dreams. If you like that movie. Yeah, so I don't mean to underrate that. I'm not exactly the right person to do the theorizing of that. I prefer to kind of muck in and just like do it.
Well, it's interesting because I think one of the things Matt's addressing is interesting to me as someone who's been involved with the local multiplayer scene for a while, and it kind of plays off of this gentleman's question of like, it's a good thing in the local multiplayer scene that there's a lot of innovation, there's a lot of games that are doing a lot of different things, but it also, for me, has always been a little disappointing, right? Because it also means that it feels like we're constantly releasing new things and we're not sitting on one thing and drilling down, right? Like let's just see how deep this idea goes. Do you have, and that was sort of connected to my interest in, like, if you guys are interested in the sports scene, but in your feelings about the local multiplayer scene, do you feel like that's good, like that we should just keep sort of like trying a bunch of different things, or?
It's not that I think there's nothing to be gained from that kind of deep drilling down. I think if you look at a game like FIFA, which I started playing with the first release, which was like 91 or something like that, and then it's been iterated sort of every single year since then. And it only got good in 2012, which is crazy. It took them over 20 years to work out how to make that game good, and it got really good. And it's sort of not completely out of nowhere, but just got across this threshold. And I guess that can happen for a lot of games. Especially FIFA was horrible when they started. It was just like worthless. So you think about what if they iterated on a game like Barbary War that was great to start with, and we had like a team of 300 people to make Barbary War 25. That could be great. I don't think that we're in a position where we need to do that though, right? I think we're still in a position where it's like, you know, the reason that we have 25 editions of FIFA is because real world football is popular. So we needed to have, for kind of industrial commercial reasons, we had to have soccer games. But you know, we don't have that constraint yet. I feel like we're nowhere near touching the edges of the creative pool. We've like, yes, it's diverse, but it's just like we've put a few feelers out, and I want to know more about the possibility space before we start like rehashing things. Not that I think it's a worthless pursuit.
One or two more questions, and then we should kind of close up. If there are one or two more questions. Yes, right here.
Well, kind of bouncing off that idea, I don't know the name of it, so excuse me for that, but this game that just came out where the first person beating is the anime same kind of thing where it started out as something similar to Hokra but not competitive. And so you took essentially a dot and you dragged it into a circle, or like a little area of gold.
Mm-hmm.
You were the first person to do that. You got to say, okay, add enemies. So the development team would go in and add enemies. You were the first person to get all the way through the enemies into the goal, and you go, all right, change the character sprite to Nicolas Cage. And literally, this is, I think it's on its like 75th iteration or something like that, over the course of less than 6 months. And I was gonna say, well, do you think the iteration is good for FIFA because you have a real world product to look at? Like, you know how soccer's supposed to be. Maybe that's why it doesn't happen for these indie games, because Barbary War is not a real thing, so it just was built in this person's imagination, and where do you go from there? But it's kind of the same idea. Like, do you think it's good for that's something that maybe more people should try, where you kind of almost crowdsource your idea?
I mean, I don't think that FIFA, this goes towards, I think your question is a good one. I think it's a good point. In fact, FIFA, I don't see as being in dialogue with real soccer, at least not anymore. It's in dialogue with the player base. So it's exactly what you're talking about. And they look at every year how people are playing, what are the dominant strategies, what turns out to be too easy, too hard. It's been developed in dialogue with the players. It hasn't got, except visually, it hasn't really gotten more like real soccer, at all.
Well, sure, but at the same time, you can't, like, EA Sports couldn't go in and put 2 goals.
Right. Okay, so it is like it is a less intense version of what you're talking about, a less extreme version, but it's the same sort of thing. And yeah, I think that for competitive multiplayer games, it's wonderful to be able to do that. So what this is, we've got these games that are like the second step in that. We had competitive games that were sort of alpha stage, that we were touring around and playing. And a lot of the ways that we've changed these games is in response, like I said, I showed that slide where Andy and Matt were just standing there with their poles up, refusing to lower their poles. That changed the design of the game. But this is the second iteration there, and I think it's absolutely kind of valid and important way that these games. Joust has been through many more iterations than that. It's been kind of tweaked and changed sort of dozens and dozens of times. So. Yeah, I'm 100% behind that. I don't think it needs to always be as extreme as like literally asking players what they want to be to put in. And I do think that kind of typically what we tell the students when they're beta testing their games is, that what I always say is you can get beta testers to show you where problems are, but you can't get them to tell you what solutions are. I think kind of that's sort of how we've approached iterating these things.
It's interesting you say that like a lot of these games are in their second step. Do you feel like you'll ever have a third step with Polaroid? Do you think do you just want it out of your system forever, or do you think maybe a while from now you might come back and say, oh, I've seen people playing this out in the wild, not at events, couch.
I never thought I'd even release it in the first place. So I never thought I'd have a first round. That's the Flash one, because I was sort of upset until I realized that you kind of need to be in dialogue, like I said, and then I put out the Flash version. And in dialogue with the players, it made me realize the things that I could change and the things that I could improve, and I developed an ambition to do it differently, and a kind of clear idea of where I wanted to take it. And so the answer to your question is it will depend on what the response is. If nobody cares about it, nobody wants to play it, I probably won't make another one. If everybody's like interacting with it and telling me like what's working and it's not working, and then I get a kind of clear idea in my head of how it would be better for super pole riders, ultra pole riders, mega pole riders, super pole riders.
Pole riders. That's the
championship edition.
How it works.
I'm not against that. I totally get why people do that. I think, but you can't predict in advance what that actual process is going to be like. It would be crazy for me to commit to that now.
All right, one more question, and then we're going to go play video games instead of talking about them. Or does everyone want to go play video games right now? Everybody raise your hand if you want to go play video games. Only one person. A smattering of people want to play. So if anyone else thinks those people look interesting, they want to talk to them while they play video games, we'll be over there. But thank you, Bennett.
Great. Thank you.